In the 21st century, the idea of sleeping in the same bed with strangers seems unthinkable, something we would only imagine in prisons or disaster shelters. Yet for centuries in Europe, it was not only common, it was normal. Families, travelers, even nobility shared beds with relatives, servants, friends, and sometimes complete strangers. This was not intimacy in the modern sense. For many, it was survival. For others, it was convenience, safety, or simply custom. But behind this practice lie stories of class, power, morality, and the blurred lines between the private and the public. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who never slept alone. One of the most striking examples comes from the English court itself. Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, ruled England for 44 years. Despite never marrying, she was rarely alone, especially at night. Records show that Elizabeth always had at least one, sometimes two, ladies-in-waiting sharing her bedchamber, often lying beside her. For her, it was both protection and performance. The presence of others ensured her virginity could not be questioned, and it was also a way to maintain surveillance and gossip within the court. Sleeping alone was considered risky, even dangerous, not only physically but morally. Solitude, in their religious imagination, could open the door to sin. Company, paradoxically, was seen as protection. The bed as a stage. To understand this, we must reimagine the bed. In early modern and 19th century Europe, a bed was not always a private sanctuary. It was often a public space, a stage for politics, ritual, and social interaction. Kings and queens received ambassadors while reclining in bed. Friends discussed politics under the covers. Beds were huge, carved, decorated, and sometimes large enough to fit 4 or 5 bodies. In many households, children, parents, and even guests would pile into the same bed. Travelers arriving at an inn might find themselves assigned to a mattress already half occupied by strangers. A letter from a Scottish traveler in 1820 complains, "I was shown to my bed only to find a French merchant already snoring beneath the sheets. The landlord thought nothing of it. I spent the night sleepless, wondering at the stranger who rolled against me with every turn." Economic reality. Part of this was economic necessity. Heating was expensive, rooms were limited, and beds themselves were valuable possessions. Sharing them cut costs. But beyond economy, there was something more primal. Warmth. Winters in Northern Europe were brutal. A body in bed meant heat. 2 or 3 meant survival. In rural households, livestock often slept in the same room, their warmth blending with the families under heavy blankets of wool. To sleep alone was to shiver. To sleep together was to endure. Class and hierarchy in bed. Yet, even in such intimacy, hierarchy ruled. In noble houses, the placement of sleepers reflected rank. The master of the house at the center, children and servants along the edges. To share the Lord's bed was a privilege, sometimes an obligation. For travelers, the hierarchy was simpler. Whoever arrived first claimed the warm spot, leaving the latecomer the cold edge of the mattress. At universities, students often slept 2 or 3 to a bed, not only to save money, but also to discourage sins of solitude. Monks, too, lay side by side in narrow dormitories, watched over by abbots who feared the temptations of the dark. Intimacy without romance. One of the hardest things for us to grasp is that sharing a bed did not necessarily imply sexual intimacy. Diaries and court records are full of casual notes. "I slept with Lord such and such," or shared a bed with my cousin. These were not confessions, but facts. It was a way of life. Just as one might share a table, one shared a bed. But of course, the proximity of bodies also created possibilities, gossip of affairs, whispered conversations, even the occasional scandal. Beds were spaces where boundaries blurred, and where public and private met in unsettling ways. The danger of the night. The night was dangerous in the 19th century. Streets were dark, inns full of thieves, diseases spread easily. To lie beside another was to gain some measure of safety. One French traveler wrote in 1843, "I felt the comfort of another's breath beside me, though I did not know his name." The world outside was filled with knives and shadows. Beds of the poor, crowded, cramped, and necessary. In the working-class quarters of London, Paris, or Vienna, beds were scarce, rooms even scarcer. Families lived in single rooms above shops, in drafty attics, or in cellars that smelled of damp earth. A single straw mattress might be all they had. Entire families, parents, children, sometimes even grandparents piled into one bed. Infants were swaddled and tucked between their mother and older siblings. Dogs and cats crawled under the covers. An English reformer writing in 1839 described, "In the alleyways of Whitechapel, I found a family of 7, all huddled upon one tattered mattress. The youngest babe suckled in sleep, while the father's feet hung over the edge. To them it was not shameful, but the only way to endure the night." Travelers' inns, a lottery of companions. For travelers, the situation was even stranger. Inns across Europe often provided beds for multiple strangers. You paid not for privacy, but for space on the mattress. One German merchant complained in 1817, "I shared a bed with a Polish soldier who reeked of onions and wine. His snoring shook the rafters. At dawn, he rose and marched out without a word. We had been bedfellows, yet strangers still. Sometimes travelers welcomed it. Lonely roads were dangerous. Robbers and wolves haunted the night. Sharing a bed with another traveler meant safety in numbers. At least if someone came with a knife, you are not alone." Universities and monasteries. The custom was not confined to the poor. At Oxford, Cambridge, and universities across Europe, students often slept 2 or 3 to a bed. Records show that fees for lodging included bed shares. Professors justified the practice as moral discipline. Solitude was suspicious. In monasteries, long dormitories lined with narrow beds placed monks shoulder to shoulder. The abbot's eyes, always watching, sought to prevent temptation. Yet it was the closeness of bodies that paradoxically made temptation possible. The bed as confessional and gossip chamber shared beds became spaces of conversation, confession, and gossip. When darkness fell and candles were extinguished, whispers filled the air. Peasants spoke of harvests and taxes. Students argued theology beneath the blankets. Lovers exchanged secret vows in whispers unheard by their guardians. In one 1825 diary, a French seamstress wrote, "I shared a bed with Jean, and though we barely knew one another by day, at night we spoke until sleep stole our voices." The bed is not only for rest, but for trust. Beds blurred the line between public and private. Secrets spoken in the night might become weapons in daylight. Scandals of shared sleep. Not all bed sharing was innocent. Proximity bred temptation, and temptation bred scandal. In country courts, accusations of improper familiarity often arose from shared beds. A servant girl accused her master. A traveling priest suspected of seducing his fellow lodger. Cousins whispering too closely in the dark. The Catholic Church, ever vigilant, warned against sinful closeness. Manuals instructed confessors to ask whether penitents had lain with another in too familiar a manner. In Protestant lands, moralists thundered that bed-sharing was a gateway to corruption. Yet the practice continued because practicality outweighed morality. Art and literature. Beds in the collective imagination. Artists and writers of the 19th century often captured these crowded nights. Etchings of inns showed rows of travelers under one blanket. Novels described servants creeping into their masters' beds, not for desire but for warmth. In Dickens' Oliver Twist, the workhouse children slept side by side, their ribs touching under thin sheets. In French novels of Balzac, boarding houses crammed their lodgers together. Paintings showed great carved beds, so wide they could hold entire families. The bed was not a private chamber. It was the stage of human necessity. Letters from the margins. One of the richest sources we have comes from letters and diaries. A young Irish maid in 1842 wrote to her sister, "I share my bed with 3 other girls. We are crowded, but we laugh ourselves to sleep. Sometimes I dream of a bed of my own, but perhaps that is only for the rich." A Spanish soldier on campaign in 1809 noted, "We lie in barns, 20 men to the floor. I woke to find a stranger's arm across my chest. It comforted me, though I know not why." Such testimonies show that the practice was not simply tolerated, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. Safety and fear of the dark. To us, the bed is a refuge of privacy. But in the 19th century, night was never safe. Darkness was full of dangers. Disease, theft, spirits imagined and real. The company of others in bed was a shield. You might risk lice or bad breath, but you also gained warmth, companionship, and the knowledge that you were not alone against the night. One French innkeeper put it plainly, "Better to hear another snore than to hear the silence of death." The rise of privacy. By the mid-19th century, winds of change were sweeping across Europe. Industrialization, urban reform, and a growing middle class began reshaping not just how people worked, but how they slept. For centuries, the bed had been a communal space. Now, the idea of the private bedroom was taking root. Architects of the new bourgeois homes insisted on separate rooms, one for parents, another for children, sometimes even separate chambers for husband and wife. Privacy became the new virtue. Where once closeness meant protection, now it suggested impropriety. Medical concerns. Medicine played its role in this transformation. Doctors began warning against the dangers of shared sleep, the spread of tuberculosis, cholera, typhus. The breath of one sleeper could carry death to another. Pamphlets circulated with stern advice. Let each man have his own bed, that he may rest in health and purity. Hygiene became a moral duty. Clean sheets, separate mattresses, ventilated rooms, these were the new commandments of middle-class respectability. Moralists and religious authorities joined the chorus. Where once churchmen tolerated or even encouraged bed sharing, they now thundered against it. The 19th century saw rising anxiety about sexuality. To lie beside another, even innocently, was to invite suspicion. A Protestant preacher in 1856 declared, "The bed must be sacred to the marriage bond alone. To share it outside of wedlock is to walk upon the edge of sin." Even siblings were increasingly separated. The notion of innocence gave way to fear. Scandals and public outrage. As attitudes changed, stories that once seemed ordinary became scandalous. A politician caught sharing a bed with a fellow traveler was accused of indecency. Boarding houses that still offered communal beds were ridiculed in newspapers. Respectable people, the editorials warned, do not sleep in company with strangers. Court cases appeared where plaintiffs sued innkeepers for immoral accommodations. The very practice that had once been survival became an emblem of backwardness. The bedroom as fortress. By the 1880s, in most middle-class homes, the bedroom was transformed. Doors had locks, curtains shielded windows. Beds were designed for one or two alone. The communal bed of peasants and travelers became a relic of poverty. Inns adapted, offering single rooms for those who could pay. Boarding schools built rows of narrow iron bedsteads, each student with his or her own. Privacy had triumphed. Memory and nostalgia, yet the memory of shared sleep did not vanish entirely. Older generations spoke of the warmth of many bodies under one quilt, of whispered stories before sleep, of the strange comfort of a stranger's breath in the dark. Folklore preserved it too. Tales and songs recalled siblings huddling together, travelers finding friendship in shared beds, lovers disguised as companions. Anthropological echoes. Anthropologists in the 20th century pointed out that communal sleeping was not unique to Europe. Across the world in Japan, Africa, and the Americas' families slept together for warmth and safety. What Europe abandoned was, in fact, humanity's oldest custom. The shift to private bedrooms, they argued, was less natural than cultural, a product of industrialization, morality, and modern anxieties about the body. The social fabric of sleep. In losing the communal bed, something else was lost. The social fabric of the night. Sleep had once been collective, a time of whispered conversations, shared dreams, mutual protection. Now it became solitary, locked behind doors, walled off from others. The new privacy gave freedom, but also loneliness. A French novelist in 1902 lamented, "We sleep alone, and perhaps we dream alone." Once, the night was full of voices. Now, it is silence. Elizabeth I revisited. Think back to Elizabeth I, who never slept alone in her long reign. To her, and to millions of Europeans before the 19th century, solitude in bed was unnatural. To us, it is the opposite. The shift in sleep tells us how deeply culture shapes even our most basic acts. To close one's eyes at night is not just biology, it is history. In the 19th century, Europe abandoned a custom as old as mankind. To sleep together was once survival, economy, warmth, morality. But with modernity came privacy, and with privacy came solitude. Today, we look back with surprise, even horror, at the thought of sharing a bed with strangers. Yet for centuries, it was the very fabric of life. The story of shared sleep is the story of how culture enters even our most intimate hours. It is a reminder that the way we rest, dream, and lie in darkness is never only natural. It is shaped by society, by fear, by love, and by history.